So this question of access is absolutely fascinating. We have brought 63% of the world online. And as the IRCAI survey points out, technology is a force for good and positive progress across the world. But there are those who still are not on the internet, the other 37%. And this is a subject that's really close to my heart. I have a podcast about the Sustainable Development Goals, and I talk a lot about inclusion. And I have some fantastic speakers coming on for you in a moment to help us explore this topic in particular. But first, we have a very special message from the permanent delegate of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to UNESCO, Her Royal Highness Haifa Al Mogrin.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am honored to participate today at the Digital Wellbeing Summit. We will write its first chapters today, yet its impact will last a lifetime. We are gathering to be part of this revolutionary, much-needed movement to ensure that technology would be safer and more inclusive. Nowadays, we are witnessing a technological revolution. From our workplaces to our homes and families, technology has brought us closer today than ever before. Technology has transformed the way we express ourselves, given sense of belonging, community, and connection to humankind. We all witnessed how digital transformation helped during COVID-19 pandemic that swept across the world, and it proved itself to be a necessity rather than a luxury. However, the digital gap spanning both in internet access and digital skills is leaving too many people behind. During the challenging times we are going through, from geopolitical tensions to health pandemics, gender inequality can be overlooked in various dimensions. Today, the digital gender gap exists across all ages, with lower internet access seen to women rather than men. This issue is greatly amplified in lower income countries. Studies show that women are 7% less likely than men to own a mobile phone and 15% less likely to use a mobile internet. There are still 234 million fewer women than men accessing mobile internet services. Moreover, 2.9 billion people are still offline. That is almost the world's third population with no internet access, where 96% live in developing countries. This digital inaccessibility deprives individuals from the opportunity to learn, work, engage with the rest of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, dear sisters and brothers of humanity, we all agree that education has the power to shape the future into a more peaceful and sustainable society. Yet, the recent pandemic disrupted education globally. More than 1.5 billion students have been affected by school closures, affecting particularly vulnerable children who do not have access to digital learning resources. Looking at the future, the world agrees that there is a need for a collective global action, where all stakeholders unite towards a common goal: governments, civil society, private sector, and most importantly, society and individuals. Bridging the digital gap requires a systematic approach for capacity building, sustainable infrastructure, and concrete steps towards strengthening global citizenship in its true meaning in our modern digital world. There are so many amazing efforts in this direction, and we are here today to share experiences and find synergies that will impact future generations. Let us work together to be part of the change. Let us make technology inclusive and safe for a better future.
So Her Royal Highness mentioned there that we're writing the first chapters on this book about digital inclusion here today. So let's meet some more of the authors of this book. I'm very pleased to have, starting from the end, we have the CEO, Door Labs, and President and co-CEO of Topology, KunHo Kim. We've also got the Digital Sector Transformation Lead, World Benchmarking Alliance, Lourdes, Montenegro. How's my pronunciation there?
Perfect.
Okay, good. And the co-founder, International Research Center on AI, and the digital champion of Slovenia, the European Commission, Marko Grobelnik. Thanks very much, everybody. Lord, I want to start with you. We heard some corporate view just a moment ago. I want you to tell me, you've been looking at companies who are digitally, how they're doing on digital inclusion to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Tell us how you're seeing them achieve this digital transformation that's inclusive, trustworthy, but also mitigates risks and harms.
Thank you. Our work is actually broader than the digital sector, and it's really all about ensuring the private sector contributes to sustainable development. And digital technologies are very important because they're widely considered to enable the achievement of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we try to create the incentives and accountability mechanism for the world's most influential digital technology companies, all 200 of them. We've already assessed 150, and that covers everyone from Adobe to ZTE, from Google, Facebook, Huawei, Tencent, Baidu, all the big names and the smaller names that we all need to know about. It's all there. And it's really thinking about inclusion in a broad way. That digital transformation is happening so fast. There's still 37% who are not online, but we got a COVID bump. A lot of people came online during the pandemic. And we need to make sure that digital transformation happens in an inclusive and trustworthy way. And there are four things we need to look at. One is access. How is this access universal? How is this access making sure no one is left behind, from vulnerable groups, poor people, rural communities, people with disabilities, etc. Then we need to look at skills, all levels of digital skills and school connectivity as well. And then we also need to ensure that companies are working to foster trustworthy use by respecting privacy, ensuring cybersecurity, and particularly paying attention to child online protection. And unfortunately, there are some not very good news on that front. And then finally, we should not forget innovation. We have to make sure that everyone has the ability to participate in innovation. So there should be open innovation, inclusive innovation. So we look at what companies are doing in terms of open standards, making sure that there are women in the technical workforce, making sure companies get feedback from a diverse range of groups when designing their products, making sure there's ethical principles behind the use of artificial intelligence. So those are the four things that we actually track companies on. We publish all these ranking and scoring freely and publicly. Feel free to go to our website, check out who's number one. And we share that data and based on that, work collaboratively with a range of stakeholders, from civil society organizations to large institutional investors in the space, in order to ensure that the digital sector has the incentive to improve their performance. Because while we need government needs to come in and regulate, technology moves so fast, scarily fast, that often policy and regulation is behind the curve. So we need to step up on the pressure on the private sector to do better and to do more, to ensure that we have a truly inclusive and trustworthy digital transformation that leaves no one behind.
Lord, who's doing well? Who is your number one? Who's not doing so well? What surprises you when you look at that report?
There are a lot of interesting things. This is very gossipy, not really, but we publish the data.
We like gossip, right?
Yeah, everyone loves gossip. We find differences across sectors. So for example, we see that the telecom companies still do better. We also benchmark, by the way, the Saudi telecom company and a number of companies in the GCC. Telecom companies seem to do better. They think of digital inclusion as part of their material issues. So in the corporate sector, if you consider something material, you report on it in your annual report, your shareholders care about that, your management cares about it. So that's the telco, but the sector that's actually lagging behind, and which makes it very scary, are IT services and platforms. So it's e-commerce, it's social media, it's all the new, what we would call IT services and platform companies. They're the ones who are lagging behind. So that's the scary thing about that. There are actually some interesting good practices we see. I'll give an example from the region, because we're close here. Zain, one of the telco companies from Kuwait, actually, we found one of their efforts on access to be particularly interesting. They provide free Wi-Fi connectivity to the Jerash refugee camps. And that's really wonderful. You're making sure that refugees are also have access to digital technologies for their own welfare and well-being. So that's really great. And there are still so many fronts that companies need to do better on. Only 27 companies out of the 150 that we've already assessed actually get passing marks.
Wow.
So if I were a teacher, I give them 1 to 100, only 27 get a score of 50 and above.
Okay, there's a long way to go.
A long way to go.
Marko, I want to turn to you. You've done a lot of different kinds of work. If we focus on AI specifically, and I'm going to quote from your latest article, it enables new ways to learn, play, interact, and live. AI can make the lives of people much more secure or even more exciting. But as it spreads across sectors, different types of AI systems deliver different benefits, such as financial prosperity and risks in areas such as human rights, personal safety. So when you look at AI from a lens of inclusion, what comes to mind?
Yeah, so AI at the end, on the bottom, right, is just simple high school mathematics, really, right? It's like a simple Lego brick. When you put together thousands of Lego bricks, right, you can get pretty complicated things. And this is today's AI, pretty much, right? Now, of course, it has some impressive results from last maybe 10 years, 20. But still, we cannot do so many more things, right? Just simple stuff which, let's say, kids would do, reading the fairy tale, this is not there yet, right? So now, inclusion, right? Inclusion means, okay, people being able to use digital tools usually, right? If you talk about digital inclusion, being able to use this, right? Now, AI has in its core trying to get away from this rigid logic, which old kind of non-AI systems were doing, and try to soften the things, so also to do mistakes, right? So AI is full of mistakes, by the way, right? So that's why it can also achieve results which old systems just cannot do, right? And now this softening of information systems, of course, brings benefits. So this means we are happier when we open the screen, right? So a machine adapts to us, right? But not always, right? Occasionally, of course, there's a long tail of possible troubles which are simply unpredictable, right? Like, let's say, autonomous car, right? Why we don't have them? Because the cost of mistakes, these mistakes of softening technology, is so high that everybody's a little bit afraid today still to use them, right? Eventually, this probably, we will give up. Mistakes won't go away, right? I mean, this is clear, right? And now this inclusion, right, and AI brings this softening of technology, and this somehow technology comes closer to us. So that's why we like search engines. Okay, social media is every second word today. shopping, but also reading, translation, vision. By the way, if you take photos, right? So it's always a layer of AI in between so that photos look just nicer, right? So we are not even aware that this, I wouldn't even say thin layer, it's typically it's quite fat layer, right, of AI. It's in between. Nobody, I mean, we technologists or researchers, we would know, right? But mostly people are not even aware, right?
Right.
So, yeah, inclusion and AI go hand in hand. And this is exactly for this bringing imperfection into this rigid computer system. So this would be kind of a short answer. And AI, by the way, it's only at the beginning, right? It looks like somehow that we did a lot of things, but it's only at the beginning.
So AI and inclusion go hand in hand, but it does matter who's able to program it, right? I mean,
oh, yeah, well, sure, yeah. But today, you know, this is one big change, actually, which happened in the last 10 years. So tasks which were like maybe 10, 15 years ago, maybe even 10, not close to impossible, but which were tasks which were solved by big labs with big effort, right? Today, undergrad students can do it by themselves, right? So this is a huge change. Plus, all the technology is for free. This might not be clear, right? We need a fairly inexpensive machine. Software is pretty much free. The only thing which is not free is data, right?
Right.
Data and users. So
depending on where you are. Places like India, it's a lot cheaper, isn't it?
Well, quality data is always expensive. Right?
Okay. We're going to come back to you, but KunHo, I want to bring you in because, you know, a couple years ago it would have been really cool to talk about AI, but now it's Web 3.0, it's the metaverse, which is exactly where you focus on inclusion. So I wonder, just what does it mean to be inclusive in your world?
I think we have to go back to the history of web. We started with 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. And it also was mentioned during this conversation that IT sector is not doing well on inclusion, meaning that e-commerce website or the websites are not really inclusive for everyone. I think what Web 3.0 is very different from the previous Web 2.0 is that composability, interoperability is embedded in Web 3.0, and open source environment is very encouraged, and transparency, permissionless protocols is bedrock of Web 3.0. So when we go to the inclusion part, I think Web 3.0 is actually, its DNA is embedded with inclusion. But at the same time, what we learned from our mistakes from previous Web 2.0, 1.0 is that a lot of times the stakeholders and then the developers were not really involved together, meaning that people who were marginalized or people who needs to be included in this this web ecosystem are not included in a sense when things were just burgeoning and trying to build. I think we're at a different time where we can actually use this opportunity when Web 3.0 is just beginning. We can start having this inclusion in mind to start.
Interesting. And tell us a little bit about how NFTs are involved and how do you bring that into this idea of inclusion?
Sure. If you think about the metaverse, we've always lived in a metaverse previously. What we mean by is that all the games that we played or all these communities that we were part of in the digital world were part of the metaverse. What's different now is that why people are so excited and talks about metaverse all the time is that we now can have property rights on this world. Before then, we didn't have any property rights. It's as if like you're living in a world, but you don't own anything. You cannot become part of it. But now, because of the emergence of NFTs, where it's non-fungible goods on the digital world, you can now become truly a part of it and own a property of it. So let me give you an example. So I don't know whether you guys played Minecraft or Diablo or Sims.
Who's played Minecraft here?
Okay, a lot of folks over here.
Name the other ones. Who's played Sims?
Sims. A lot of folks over here. So you live in Sims world, Minecraft world. You build some asset over there. You own some items over here. But when you move to Minecraft or Sims, vice versa, you cannot bring anything. So in this world's, I guess, example is that when you're moving from Saudi to the United States or Saudi to the United Kingdom or Korea, what you need to do is that at the airport, you literally need to strip naked and cannot bring anything. But what makes it possible in Web3 and Metaverse world, because we can now actually own these goods and properties rights on this digital world, you can now start bringing things around. And I think this is why people are getting so excited, because now we can actually build an actual world on top of the digital world. And it's as if like we found this empty land where we can do so many experimentation and so many things can actually happen. Before then, the digital world is a world where we can actually simulate, but we cannot own anything.
But how does that increase inclusion?
Yes, it goes back to inclusion, because in a world that you cannot own anything, inclusion is not embedded. But once we start owning things, we start thinking about how do we include people who are marginalized or people who are not included. And that's why the ethos of Web 3.0 is open, transparency, permissionless protocols. If you look at Web 2.0, where only the world is on the visual side of it, or just I guess right word would be just a simulation of this digital world, is that it's all, the power is all siloed into a corporate company, and all they talk about is protecting their IP rights, and people cannot really own anything. So if you go fast forward to Web 3, that's why our ethos in Web3 and Metaverse world is even so-called open metaverse is what truly means for the future of the metaverse, is that people focus on openness, transparency, and permissionless protocol. It's as if like if you're trying to make clothes in this world, in any part of the world, you don't need to ask permission from God or anyone above there. I think that should be the same for digital world. We should have this open protocol and permissionless protocol so we can make goods and start owning assets however we want.
Lourdes, how did the gaming companies do in your report? Did they get a
not so well, actually. We have some gaming companies. They still need to do better. We have
in what in particular?
There, Microsoft. Microsoft does well. It is in the top 10. It just joined last year. But it's very particularly interesting because we're seeing some cultural divides in terms of concerns based on geography. So for US companies, when they talk, for example, about safety, and when they talk about child online safety, for example, it's often about online sexual abuse. This is the focus. But for Asian companies, especially the Chinese big tech, it's often addiction. So there's a very big cultural divide. So the gaming companies need to do more. But I'm just wondering if I could say something about what KunHo said, because it's all very interesting, but I feel like I'm from an older generation, but I feel like I heard all these from cyberpunk literature at the beginning of the internet, and that was the dream, permissionless, open innovation. But over the years, with monetization, with big corporate profits playing a role, it's been eroded. The ethos has been eroded. So I'm just wondering if we can ensure that that still
How is it going to be different this time?
Yeah.
KunHo?
I think what's different this time, what I've been hearing and what I've been echoing a lot is that this is actually the time where the ethos of the cyberpunk can actually come true, because people can start owning things. And I think inclusion, in some sense, cannot be really enforced by one entity. We should make the system open to everyone so that we can include it, because we cannot forcefully include people. What happens is that once we make this a system where people can join and start owning the parts, and they can actually start voicing out for their interest. And I think that is the most important part of the inclusion. But of course, this debate about what exactly means and who should lead the inclusion part is up to a great debate, I guess.
Okay. Marko, let's bring you back in because you've also thought about inclusion from a services perspective, haven't you?
Sure. I mean, relationship is two-sided, right? So maybe 3 sentences how the ecosystem looks like, right? So on one side we have people, right? Then we have the middle layer services which serve us, right? And on the other side, typically we have a small group of geeks or some kind of people which try to tune these services which, are serving us, right? So now we include services in our lives as well as services are including us, right? So this is this two-sided relationship which has now, if you would analyze, right, how the communication goes and adaptability and so on, you would see that this has all elements of a society, right? Semi-artificial society. This is what's the gist of this discussion. Now, also going back to this metaverse, right, which is a little bit more complex type of service. It's not just like click and go, right, or like and okay, dislikes are not around these days. Retweet, okay. This is way more complicated. A service which so my point was all these services are bringing changes in our lives, right? And now these changes have also properties like, well, we all know COVID, right? Virus.
Yep.
So if you look the way how virus is affecting society, right? So these services and metaverse, I guess, will have lots of influence as well. Treat us also in the same way, or we react in a very similar way as we react to virus, right?
Give us an example of what you're talking about.
So there was a time before social media, for instance, right? Since we discussed the social media today a lot, well, there was a time, so nobody missed it, right? But then it appeared, right? There was this first wave of early adopters, right, which was lots of exciting addiction. It was unclear what's right, what's wrong, and so on. And then there was a second wave, third wave, pretty much like COVID, right? And now somehow this is like stabilizing. It's kind of the culture on social media learned how to serve people in the same way people learned how to behave on social media, mostly. Of course, there are still addictions and all these troubles which we are touching these days, but this is roughly the same type of system. So either COVID infection or social media addiction have also treatment is not far away. Okay, we don't have vaccines against social media right yet, but this is the point, right? So we shouldn't look at these areas separately. Disease, psychology, mental, physical disease, and digital diseases, which typically we would say, okay, addictions, but it's just habits. So every change in our lives actually requires a little bit of exploration, right? And you have the curve of the users, early adopters, skilled ones, some people which fulfill their lives, and you have these laggards which maybe won't ever touch these services. The same is probably was with radio, with television, maybe even with newspapers in the past. It's just, for us, this is just bread and butter, right? So we don't even ask about these things. But all these elements kind of were changing society, right? And remember internet in early 90s, right? So it was the same thing, right? So today, back then, there was one problem which everybody was mentioning, right? You just start clicking and you're lost in the space. So now after 30 years, roughly, yeah? A little bit less, maybe 29. We got used to this, right? We also have tools to control our usage of internet. Back then, it was not clear, right? So just wanted to say this, these things are similar.
Okay. So let's go back to AI. Lourdes, your report says that in its enthusiasm about AI benefits, the industry fails to consider its risks.
Yeah, that's what we saw from the data is that of the 150 companies that we actually rank and score, only 20% of them have anything, a public commitment to follow ethical AI development and use.
That doesn't sound very inclusive.
Definitely, that's really scary because that includes companies in the space like Palantir Technologies, iFlyTech, and all the big names in the space that are mining data and using algorithms do not really pay attention to ethics or ethical use and deployment of algorithms. So we're putting together a big group, a coalition, and we invite anyone here, please just approach me if you want to be involved. We're going to try to create the incentives for all the big technology companies to set the example and follow ethical principles in artificial intelligence development and use.
Okay.
May I just add one small thing? Like, okay, today we are complaining about this unethical use of AI, right? Like you just mentioned, right? Let's turn back time 20 years ago. So just the time after September 11, right? So compared to today, what was happening back then, this was even Wild West is a mild term, right? So all the data was available, governments mostly, right, digging into lives of pretty much anybody and so on, right? So this was back then, right? So this is where the term data mining, not that it was coined 10 years before.
But 20 years ago, it was worse.
20 years ago was total worse, right? I mean, total disaster. And then this was then kind of going, again, was getting cultivated in a way, right? And today, the issue is, right, that there's no regulation on AI. It's being prepared, right? So I'm involved in OECD, Council of Europe, in European Commission, in UNESCO, right? So all these organizations are like for last, after 2017, roughly, preparing these documents. But again, what was the problem, or what is the problem? That on one side you have policymakers, lawyers, right? On the other side you have technologists. And when we met for the first time, like maybe 5 years ago, we spotted that we don't speak each other's languages. Now within these 5 years, we are slowly learning, right? How to talk to each other. And as a result, you are seeing already this ethical documents and principles and so on, and the first legally binding legislation is coming out, like I guess in a year's time.
Okay.
AI Act. This will be the first legally binding document, right? So this is how maturity goes on, right? And again, this intrusion of algorithms and the power of what's extractable first totally overwhelmed governments first, companies then, and only after like 15, 20 years somehow we started thinking maybe it's good to regulate.
Right. Okay. KunHo, I want to come back and I want to hear a positive story. I know that you're doing some really interesting things around wheel cards. Tell us about that. How is that inclusive?
That was the project, I think, the world's first project that included people with disabilities on NFTs. And we're making inclusive metaverse. What that means that we are creating, I think, in a world where, I think, going back to the emergence of metaverse, or Web3 world, we're at just the dawn of the entire movement. And what I felt that is that a lot of the mistakes that we made in Web 1.0, 2.0 is that we forgot to include people with marginalized, people with disabilities. So I started the project during Tokyo 2020 with Korea Paralympics Committee, and we made wheelchair NFTs and used the proceeds to make a scholarship in Vietnam called Fulbright University Vietnam to support students with disabilities. And on top of that, we are creating a kind of inclusive world on top of digital world so that people with disabilities can be represented. And I think that kind of initiatives needs to happen on this kind of a new land and new world that we're building. And also on top of that, we're creating at Topology, we're creating infrastructure so that these worlds that we're going to create on top of the digital worlds can be connected, fully, embracing the composability and interoperability of these worlds. I think I mentioned a little bit about how in current digital world, when you're moving from one world to another world, you cannot bring anything. But what we are trying to do at Topology is that if there are protocols around that are open, that connects these worlds, we'll actually have a very interesting world where you can actually bring different assets and also have a more of a collaborative and kind of a universe that we've kind of experienced a little bit in the current world. I think we throw around the conversation a lot about the distinction between, a stark distinction between the digital world and the real world. But if you actually look at current life that we're living right now, I think these two worlds are very interconnected. And I think that's why it's very important to talk about the well-being of the digital world, because it's part of our life. Whether we like it or not, we'll live in that world. And I think the conversation that we're having over here is very important. And also we are, I think, excited in a way that we're preparing for the future so that all of our well-being is emphasized.
Marko's actually not only with us on the panel, but he's also in the digital world taking pictures of us. So
oh, yeah. I mean, I'm taking pictures of the pictures.
I don't even know what to make of that. Lourdes, we heard there from KunHo about people with disabilities not being included. Your report says more women are needed in tech. I would like £1 for every time I've read that sentence. We've been saying this for years. What needs to happen?
There's still not a lot of progress, but 3 things need to happen. 1, we need to make sure that diversity data is not a trade secret. Unfortunately, it is treated like a trade secret. That's the sad thing. It's very hard to extract diversity data from companies. And so only 1/3 of 150 of the world's largest tech companies report women in technical roles. That's very few, and very few even report how many are in R&D teams. You know, the secret to inclusion is to make sure that the developers of technology come from diverse backgrounds and viewpoints, and that's the secret, and we don't see that. So, and the second thing is the definition of technical roles. It's not there. So different companies define it differently, different countries define it differently. And finally, the third thing that needs to happen is there needs to be a support for women-led businesses, women startups, making sure that there are enough women at the highest levels of corporate governance. Some companies have made great strides already. The highest, I think, we saw was 33% women in technical roles. Guess which company?
Any guesses? What is it?
It's a Chinese company, Baidu. And you can see it in their products, in their maps. They ensure that breastfeeding mothers easily find facilities to breastfeed their kids. And this is, you know, part of the perspectives of women being included.
Interesting. All right. Last sentence from you. One thing that everyone here can do to be more inclusive when they use digital technology.
So why I was taking pictures, right? So this was inclusion as well, because pictures go right away to my mother. She's 85, right? And this is
Amazing.
one way how she participates here. So this is my participation.
Perfect. All right, KunHo, one way to be more inclusive.
I guess own part of the digital world and then participate, because if you own things, you can, people listen to your voice and you be more active. And I think that is the first way that we can actually go to true inclusion on the internet and the digital world.
Okay, Lourdes?
Let's work together. Let's collaborate, cooperate, SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals. So if you see me around, come and say hi, and let's find ways to cooperate.
Thank you very much to all of my panel. Really appreciate it. Coming up next, we're going to look at relationships in the digital age, and I'd like you guys to consider this question. If you had to choose between the mobile phone in your hand or in your pocket, or having a close friend, which one would you choose? So Etna Trainer is going to be back with her panel in a few moments to discuss this. Thanks very much.